Hi everyone, and welcome. My name is Dale, and this is the 5th video in a series of videos dedicated to helping those interested in theatrical design and technical theater get into college programs, get internships, or get jobs. In the last few videos, I've specifically focused on the theatrical portfolio, and in this video, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, and we're going to talk about the theatrical resume. In this video, I'm specifically going to be talking about principles that might apply to a technical or design resume, but a lot of the overarching principles can be applied to anyone in the theatrical industry, at least to some degree. In this video, I'll be focusing on the content that you should include in your resume, different ways you can lay out that content, and methods of putting together the resume so that you can easily update it as you continue to grow your career in the future. Before we get into talking about content and layout, I think it's important to discuss the differences between a theatrical resume and a standard business resume. The most important difference in my mind is that for a standard business resume, there's an expectation that no matter where you've done the job, you will list the responsibilities and kind of the details of the job underneath the title of the job that you have done. So you would kind of list the duties or the things that you did while you were there doing that job. Whereas with the theatrical resume, those responsibilities are kind of assumed by the job title that you put on your resume. So if you were a theatrical stitcher for a company, you would not need to list the responsibilities associated with that job. The person looking at your resume would see that you've listed that as your job title, and they would make the assumption that you have those basic skills, things like basic hand sewing, machine sewing, maybe using a serger, the ability to work off of instructions to do alterations, some basic things that kind of are assumed within the responsibility of that job title. In a different part of your resume, you will be able to list specific skills and skill sets that you have, so you don't have to list those under each particular job that you have. And that kind of goes along with the second thing that I think is important to talk about in regards to differences between the two types of resumes, in that a standard business resume can be multiple pages long, and that as you continue to add job responsibilities and list those expectations, that will take up multiple pages. Whereas a theatrical resume generally wants to be contained to one single-sided page. You don't want it to overflow onto a backside of a page. You want it to be all on one visible page. And so that kind of aligns with this idea of containing this information. So instead of repeating the same job responsibilities for each position that you've done, you can now put them in a separate section of your resume and allow the job title to stand on its own. So those two components I think are really important. The way that we list our skill sets and our responsibilities, and then also how much space does our resume take up. So a theatrical resume is generally contained to one single-sided page with the job responsibilities listed in a separate area from the job title that you've actually completed. And we'll look at that when we look at the different layouts of resumes here in a little while. Regarding the content of my resume, I generally break it down into sections. And those include personal information, professional credits or your theatrical work, education and training, related skills, and references. These different categories can be broken down into subcategories, and we'll look at that a little bit as well, but this is kind of a good starting place to break down the content that you want to include in your resume and figure out how you want to put that on the page. I generally start by putting my personal information at the top. This is going to be the very first thing that the person looking at your resume sees, so it's important that it connects to you in a personal way. This will include your name, generally your professional name, which can be different than your legal name, but doesn't have to be, and the role that you are looking to pursue. Those two things are the most important thing to include at the top. The rest of the personal information is mostly contact information, and this can be included at the top, although I have seen some people listing it at the bottom of their resume as well. But it is important to know that that information does need to be included. So the contact information is generally going to include your email address that you're going to use for professional purposes, and your phone number that people can reach you at. I also like to list the city and the state that I live in, and my website. So if you have the website, you can also list your social media platforms if you use your social media for kind of sharing your theatrical work. If your social media is more personal and lifestyle, then it probably doesn't belong on your theatrical resume. But if you are using your social media platforms to share your theatrical work, kind of as a subset of your portfolio, you can absolutely list your social media links on your resume. That's a great way to share that information, but only if you use it for those purposes. The reason that I only list my city and state instead of my full address on my resume is twofold. The first is that, for the most part, people aren't communicating through mail anymore. If you were going to get any communication from a company or a school, it's probably going to come through email. So the email is going to be the most important piece of communication information you can put on your resume. If a company or a school needs your full mailing address, they can generally get it that way or through other pieces of paper that you might submit outside of your resume. The second reason I don't list my full address on the resume is for safety reasons. This is where you live, and you don't know who's going to look at your resume, and so putting that information out there in the world gives people access to your personal home information that they may not need to have in a broad scheme. Again, if you are in business with someone or you are looking to go to a specific school and they need that information, there are other ways for them to get it than putting it on your resume. So those are the two reasons why I don't list my full address on my resume. You can absolutely do whatever you feel comfortable with, but that's kind of my recommendation for the resume. I do think it's beneficial to at least include the city and the state that you reside in so that a school knows if you are from in-state or out of state, or if you will be commuting to campus, or if you will be, so there are considerations in regards to that. And then for professional work, it's helpful for them to know if there's going to be any travel costs in bringing you to their company, or if you'll need housing, or if you live local to the job that you're applying for. So all of those things can be helpful in communicating that information just simply by listing your city and state on your resume. No more necessary than that. I mentioned it with the portfolio, but it's worth repeating here that your portfolio and your resume are companion documents. They are working together in order to get you the thing you want, either admission into a college program or an internship or a job. So aligning those two pieces of documentation can be really important, and there are a couple of ways you can do that. The first is with the font choices that you make. So by using the same kind of font style and heading on your portfolio as you use on your resume can help tie those two pieces of documentation together. The second is making sure that you use the same job title on both your portfolio and your resume. And then the third is making sure that some of the projects that are in your portfolio are also listed on your resume or vice versa. So it's good to be able to look at the resume and see shows that you've worked on and at least have some of those shows in the portfolio that people can see, I worked on this production and here it is in my portfolio. Not every show that's on your resume needs to be in your portfolio, and not every show that's in your portfolio needs to be on your resume, but it's good to have a little bit of crossover between the two pieces. If for a job you're also creating a cover letter using the same header of your name and your job title on both your resume and the cover letter, can also be a great way to tie all of those pieces together as you apply for what you're looking for. In regards to your professional credits or your theatrical production work, there are a few approaches you can take. We're going to talk about how to lay out the content a little bit later, but specifically thinking about what content to include, I think that there are some required, necessary elements that you have to include in this part of your resume, and then there are some other elements that you can include if you would like to. For me, the necessary, required, absolute must-haves on this part of your resume are your job title. So that is the official title that you were given either on your contract or in the program that you did on the production. What was the name of the production? So what production or project was this particular job for? And where did you do the project? So what was the name of the school or the company, the theater that you did this project at? Those are the three necessary elements for me that you should include in this part of the resume. If you would like to, you can absolutely include other information. So some examples of that would be your supervisor. So if you are a technician, that would be maybe your designer or supervising technician. If you are a designer, that would probably be the director of the production. If you're a stage manager, you can use the director or possibly a production manager, depending on what your role was with the production. So think about who can kind of support your work on the show. Listing them can be really beneficial. Other things that you might include would be the year that the production took place during. I go back and forth on whether or not I think it's beneficial to include the year. Sometimes it can be helpful to just show that you've been working consistently, that you've been doing a lot of things, that you don't have any big time gaps in your resume. But then you also kind of don't need to have that. You can just show the work that you've done and the roles that you've done with those productions. You don't necessarily need to box yourself into a time. So those are kind of some examples that you might also include on your resume. You don't have to include those things. They might be helpful. They're absolutely not detrimental to include, but they're also not necessary. So things to think about when you're considering how much space you have on your resume and how much information you want to convey. How you list your education and training on your resume is probably going to depend on where you are in your schooling process. If you're in high school, you're going to want to list the name of the high school that you attend and then the year that you expect to graduate. You do not need to list your current year if you're a freshman, sophomore, junior, or senior. That's not necessary. The year that you expect to graduate is going to fill all that information in for us. Once you get to college, you're actually going to replace the high school information with college information. So you will have the name of the institution that you are attending. You will also want to list the degree or degrees that you are planning to earn at that institution, and then the year that you expect to graduate. So for myself, on my resume, I went to Illinois Wesleyan University, and so I would put Illinois Wesleyan University. I would put the degree I earned, which was a BA in theater, and then I would put the year that I expected to graduate, which was in 2006. So I would list all of that information on my resume. And then that information never goes away. Once you have your college information on there, it stays there. And then you just continue to add onto it as you build your education and degrees. So if you earn your bachelor's degree or Bachelor of Fine Arts degree, you would keep that on there, and then if you decided to go back and earn a master's or a master's in fine arts, you would list that underneath your bachelor's degree, and then if you decided to go and get a PhD on top of that or another kind of doctoral degree, you would list that in addition to that. So you kind of keep stacking your education once you get into college. Trainings are anything that is done outside of the classroom. I'm a firm believer that your classroom education is part of your school education. So if you are in a high school program and you want to list that you've taken like some theater classes, that's okay. But I can probably kind of assume that based on what you've done, that you've done some theater work based on your resume and your credits that you've done. In a academic, like a college or university setting, I'm going to assume that based on the degree that you're earning, that you're taking specific kinds of classes. So I don't need to have those kinds of trainings listed. So if you're getting a BFA in design or in technology, I'm going to assume that you're probably taking some drafting classes and some rendering classes and some design classes, probably some scenic painting classes or props classes. So I'm going to assume that that's all built in to the degree that you're getting. So I would not list those as training on my resume. However, if I did anything above and beyond the classroom, so if I went and did a special scenic painting intensive program over the summer, I would list that in the training section. What the program was that I went to, and if I earned any kind of certificates by finishing or completing that training. So there are all kinds of trainings you can get in all of the different types of theatrical elements. I'm not going to give you a comprehensive list, but generally thinking about those things is outside of the classroom trainings or above and beyond what you're getting within the span of your general education. Your related skills area is essentially where those job responsibilities that you would find in a business resume end up in a theatrical resume. So this is where you list all of the kind of skill sets that you have that you think support your ability to do the job that you are applying to do, or the degree that you are trying to earn. I generally break these down into like mini categories and then list them in that order related to what I want to do. So I generally start with any skills that directly impact the job that I want to do. So kind of going back to my theatrical stitcher, this is where I would list that I have competency in hand sewing and machine sewing, and I might list the specific machines that I have experience with. If I have the ability to use a serger, I might do that. Or if I've done any work with industrial sewing machines, that would be a great place to list this. Any additional specialty skills like embroidery or knitting or crocheting can kind of go in this area as well, because they all kind of support that basic principle of the theatrical stitcher. You can build some of this skill set off of the job description that the job is using to when you're applying. So kind of tailoring some of that can be kind of a trick. Once you've listed those kind of essential skills for the job, you can kind of use related skills. So again, with the theatrical stitcher, that might be if you have skills in jewelry fabrication or any other kind of specialty clothing like corsets or making hats or shoes, or if you have makeup experience. All of that kind of supports the skills of the stitcher and can kind of help build that that list of things that make you qualified for that job. Once you've kind of gone through those, then you can list any other related skills that are from the theatrical industry, things like prop skills or painting skills, electrical, sound, anything like that. Then I kind of think about any technologies that I have. These can be computer programs like CAD software, video and audio editing softwares, photo editing softwares, and then document processing, things like the Microsoft Suite or the related things that kind of correspond to Google or Apple, whatever kind of processing documents, things like Word or Excel or PowerPoint that you feel comfortable saying that you can use. So those kinds of technologies. And then you kind of get into documentations that support what you are capable of doing. Things like if you have a valid driver's license, that's a great thing to put on your resume. If you have a valid passport and you're looking for international work, that's going to be really important. Probably want to include that on your resume. A lot of places are now listing that you need to have an up-to-date COVID vaccination. So listing that you have an up-to-date COVID vaccination card can be great to put on your resume. And in this, related skills is the place to put that kind of stuff. So you kind of find and develop the content that goes into here. When you're first starting out, I generally go with the idea of more is better. And then as you build and hone your skills and tailor them to the specific job that you want to do, some of those kind of additional skills that are outside of the area you're interested are going to start to peel away. And that's totally fine. I have some skills that are like, I can use a sewing machine. I'm not very good at it, but I can. But because my interests are in lighting design, sound design, I don't list the fact that I can use a sewing machine because it doesn't directly impact my job that I'm interested in doing at this stage of my career, at least. So those are things to think about when you are putting together the skills for your resume. Especially if you were first starting out, it's helpful to list references on your resume. These would be people that can help support your ability to do the job that you want to do. That can say, yes, this person that is applying for this job or this academic program has the skill sets and the experience that they say they have on their resume, and I think that they would be a great addition to your program or your company. Generally, when you're listing these people, you're going to want kind of a minimum of 3. You can have a little bit more than 3, but I don't think you need more than 3. But less than 3 is really problematic. 3 is kind of the magic number. For these people, you're going to want to make sure you list their name, their job title, and generally this is going to correspond to something else we see on your resume, either a school you have attended or a production company that you have worked for, and their contact information, either their email or their phone number, ideally both, but at least one or the other. And the most important thing with your references is ask your references if they're okay with you listing them as a reference before you put them on your resume. Most of the time, anyone you think you want to list as a reference is going to be totally on board. Every once in a while, you're going to be like, oh yeah, I want this teacher that I had 5 years ago to be on my resume as a reference. And that teacher might have fantastic things to say about you, but they might need a little bit of a refresher on who you are before you put them on your resume. So reach out to that person and say, hey, you might not remember me. I was a student of yours and I would like to list you on my resume as a reference. Are you okay with that? And then they can kind of refresh on who you are. The last thing you want is for someone to contact the references on your resume and they don't remember who you are, or they don't have great things to say about you. So checking in with your references before you put them on there ensures that you're going to get good, solid recommendations from everyone you put on your reference list. There are a few basic things to think about with the layout of your resume before you even begin to put anything on the page. The first thing is your page margins. So these are going to depend on how much content you actually need to include on your resume. If you are first starting out, you're probably not going to have an overwhelming amount of production information or a backlog of skills that you're going to include on your resume. And so you may not need to change the margins of your page in order to kind of compensate for that information. But if you are a little bit later in your career and you've built up some credits and you've built up a pretty wide range of skills, it might be beneficial to get that extra space on the page by just taking the margins on the page to as wide as possible. This way you can use as much of the page space as you can to kind of get as much information on the resume as you want to, which is really good. The second thing to think about is what font you want to use for your resume. This is going to be for the main content of your resume. It's going to be different than the font you think about using for your name. Your name font is like a special thing. It's separate than everything else that you do on your resume or in your portfolio. But the font that you use for all of the rest of the information in your resume, it should be given some thought. I generally recommend using a sans serif font, so meaning without the little decorative tags, something that is in line with Arial or Times New Roman or Helvetica. But don't box yourself into those. There are tons of font options available in these programs, and it's really fun to kind of play around with what font you want to use and kind of making it personal to you by choosing a font that's just a little bit out of the ordinary. The most important thing that I'm going to say about fonts, though, is that it has to be legible. It has to be able to be read in whatever size you're going to print your resume at. It has to be able to be read as a standard type, as bold, italics, underlined. Anything that you're going to do to that font, test it before you choose to use it, because the last thing you want is to kind of get into something and then decide that you don't want. I mean, it's easy to change the font, but it can impact some of the formatting of things. So just kind of playing with your fonts and deciding what you want to use before you get into the content creation, I think is a really good idea. But play with what you want, figure out what's going to work best for you, and again, before everything else, make sure that whatever font you choose is primary purpose is to be able to be read. Those fancy fonts are great, but they are not great for your resume content. Okay, so let's look at some of the ways that I would recommend laying out the information in your resume. To start with, I recommend using the header for your name and job position. This will keep that information safe as you edit the content for the rest of your resume. It also allows that information to be a completely different font style and size without having to isolate it as you make changes to those elements within the rest of your resume. So if you're doing a select all, it kind of keeps it from being included in that choice. The next thing I would say is to get familiar with tables. The table tool in Microsoft Word is my absolute favorite thing. It allows me to break the page into portions where I can organize information. I find that using tables, especially for your production information, is a huge time and energy saver compared to trying to use columns. Columns are intended to wrap information from the bottom of one column to the top of another column. They are not designed to create linear pieces of information. So by using columns, you're kind of setting yourself up for a struggle when you're using this kind of technology in Word. You're also going to have a really hard time updating your resume because as you add or change information, the columns will shift and change. And so then trying to get everything to line back up again can be really challenging. Some of the things that I really like about tables are that you can create tables that have a set number of columns, but you can always use the merge tool to combine columns or rows together to create one larger block of information. Another thing I like is that the cell size for a table will expand as you include information, so you don't have to worry about wrapping text. As you continue to input things, it will adjust the height of your cell accordingly. You can also choose what text alignment you want from column to column or even from cell to cell, depending on how you're arranging the information within your table. So content that you're using at one part of your table can be left aligned, some can be centered, and some can be right, depending on how you want your information to display. I like to keep my production company, my theater information, my production title, and the director name all left aligned. This keeps all of these visible starting lines for that information together on the resume, and it gives it a really nice clean look as opposed to having it centered or right aligned where the edges of the text are kind of all over the place. And my favorite feature is that I can remove the visible border of the table when I'm done editing so that it won't show when I print the resume. I can turn it back on when I need to work on my information, when I need to adjust anything within the table, and then I can make those borders disappear so that when it prints as kind of a clean open page. I use tables to input my personal information, my production information, and the information for my references. Everything else I'll write out in separate lines or as lists. For my educational information, I put each component on its own line of the resume. For my related skills, I list these out in one continuous string. I've never really felt the need to separate my skills into a table or bullet pointed list. I tend to think that this takes up too much space. And it doesn't really make it easier for people to read the skills or find the information. But you should absolutely play with it and see what works best for you. Once you've put all of the information into your resume that you want, including your personal information, your production work, your education and training, your skills, and your references, then you can go back and think about the font size. So now we've got all of this information on our page. We can kind of look and see how much of the page is it taking up. Is it taking up not quite a full page, and maybe we want to make our font size just a little bit bigger so that it can take up a little bit more of the page and less blank space? Or have we overshot and we're now on to a second page and we need to use a slightly smaller font size in order to shrink the information down? Generally, when you're kind of looking at those ranges, you don't really want to use a font size above 14 on the high end and nothing below 10 or 11 on the low end, and that sort of depends on your font choice. Certain font sizes will actually appear visibly different depending on what size you choose. So again, legibility is the big key. If you go too small, people won't be able to read the information as clearly. So it's worth experimenting with the size, printing it, seeing if it's going to be legible, and then making adjustments based on that. If once you've changed your font size, you still don't fit everything in, you can kind of think about reformatting what's on the page or starting to peel things out of your production information that aren't as important, or skills that aren't necessarily as relevant to the job that you're looking for. Remember that your resume doesn't need to be everything you have ever done, but it should include the most recent work that you've done, the work from the most reputable or the largest companies, or the most recognizable or prominent works that are listed on your resume. So I'm going to show you now some examples of different resume formats that you might think about when you are putting your resume together. So this is my personal resume, and it's a pretty straightforward layout. It makes use of the header at the top, tables for personal information and professional work, with my basic information of the company, the show, and the director listed. I don't need to list the position that I was on the show because all of the positions that I have done on these shows are the same as the job title that I have at the beginning of my resume. So that's a really important thing to remember as well. If the job that you are looking for is the same as all of the types of jobs that you've done for everything on your resume, you don't have to include that. It can be assumed by the reader that if I'm looking to be a lighting designer, all of this work that I have listed is work that I have been a lighting designer on. So that can also help to save some space when I'm putting my resume together. Then I list my education and training. I also list my current occupation because I have a full-time job, and that can actually impact what kind of work I'm available for, and my related skills. You'll notice that I don't list my references, but I do have a note that I'll provide them upon request. Again, if you are first starting out, I do recommend that you list your references. This second example that I'm going to show you is a bit more, I'm going to call it artistic in its layout. This format uses a column method, but it divides the page into the theatrical production information in one column and everything else in the second column. So with this format, one of the things that you might want to consider is, do you have enough information in your production information to fill that whole side of the page? Or do you want to balance it with other material? This is a really interesting way to show the information and to share that. But you want to make sure that you're not leaving huge pieces of empty space on your resume. Big visual gaps are kind of jarring to look at on the page. So any way we can lay it out so that it looks like one smooth document is definitely going to be important to think about. So again, I still have my personal information, I have my references, I have my skills, and then on the far side, I have all of my production information. I've just kind of separated the two visually on different sides of the page. This next example shows the options to kind of split your theatrical information into the roles that are aligned with the job that you've done, and then a section for roles that are supportive of the job that you want to do. So if I were listing that I wanted to be a lighting designer, I would list in this top section all of the lighting design work that I'd done, but maybe it's not enough to fill a whole resume. So underneath, I might say related theatrical work, and I can list assistant lighting design work, or head electrician work, or electrician, or spotlight operator work, or light board programmer. All of the things that might relate to my ability to design, but aren't necessarily directly design work. So depending on where you are in your experience and how much of what you want to do you've actually already done, this is actually a good way to show and to highlight the work that you have done in the area that you really want to do, while not completely getting rid of the work that will support your ability to do the job that you're interested in. If you're someone that has a more artistic bent than I do, you may start looking outside of document creation programs to create your resume, such as Adobe Illustrator or Canva. These programs create really beautiful work, but I do feel that you trade that in for the ability to quickly and easily add, edit, and remove information. Something important to remember is that you are going to be continuously adding new productions or new positions, new skills, replacing old content, and overall changing the way your resume looks as you grow and develop as an artist. Although I wouldn't restrict anyone from using programs like these to create their resumes, I would absolutely warn them that this is a struggle that they might come upon when they go to update their resumes in the future. The paper you print your resume onto isn't as important as the paper you print your portfolio materials onto, but it isn't far off. You should absolutely be giving consideration to what type of paper you want to print your resume onto, and not just doing the easy route of printing it onto copy paper. If that's all that's available, then that's what's available, and that will be fine. But it is always nice to know that you've given some consideration to what material you want your resume to be printed onto. So some things to think about with that paper. The first is, if the paper has a specific design, you absolutely want to make sure that that design is not going to be impacted by the content of your resume, or vice versa. So by testing your resume onto a paper with a specific design, you're making sure that you can still read all of the content that you've put onto your resume, and that the design isn't impacting the viewer's ability to kind of get all of the information, or is it distracting them from the information that's really important, which is the content of your resume. The other thing you can think about is the paper color. So you can absolutely go with white paper. There's absolutely nothing wrong with white paper. But for resumes, I actually like using something that's a little bit like an off-white, or like a light tan, or a beige, or even something that's kind of like a light peach color. Just something that has a little bit of a tint to it, but not enough that it's going to feel like a colored paper. This makes it stand out a little bit from all of the other pieces of resume that are printed on white paper, which is always kind of fun. And it kind of gives it that extra step up. Again, white, there's nothing wrong with white paper, and you can absolutely print onto white paper, but you might consider some of these other options that are out there. A lot of prefabricated resume paper is going to be in these kind of tinted colors. So those are things to look at as well. The final thing to think about with your paper choice for your resume is the paper thickness. So I talked a lot about this with the portfolio with cardstock versus standard copy paper. Resume paper generally wants to be somewhere in the middle. General copy paper is really thin. You can see through it really well, and it doesn't necessarily have kind of the structural thickness and weight that you can benefit from having a slightly thicker paper. So if a person is holding a piece of copy paper up, it might have a tendency to kind of like flop over, whereas a little bit thicker paper is going to hold up a little bit better when people are looking at it. However, cardstock is probably going to be a little too thick. So you want something in the middle. So kind of reference is standard weight for copy paper, kind of like the thickest paper for copy paper that you can generally get is about 32 pounds. And the thinnest cardstock paper you can get is about 65 pounds. That's kind of how they're rated. So you're looking for something that's going to be sort of in the middle and play a little bit with those. You might want it to be a little bit closer to that 32 or a little bit closer to that 65. Kind of depends on your personal preference. You don't want something that's super thick because it's going to get really heavy for you to carry around, but it's also going to get kind of cumbersome for the person that is using the paper. You still kind of want something that can be easily folded, and cardstock really doesn't fit in there. So giving those extra considerations to your paper can really make your resume stand out from the pile. So those are kind of my thoughts on the theatrical resume. Just remember that when you're putting your theatrical resume together, there are a few key things that you want to keep in mind. The first is that the resume is a professional document, and it is meant to communicate your history with the theatrical job that you are interested in pursuing. So making sure that whatever you do with your resume, it kind of centers around that. Be honest on your resume. Don't oversell, but don't undersell either. Make sure that everything that you put on your resume you can do, and all of the jobs that you list, make sure that they're truthful, that they are the actual job that you did for that production, and the correct title of the job that you did for that production. A pretty resume is nice, but should not supersede an easy to read resume. So again, the most important thing about the resume is communicating your skills, your ability, your job history. And as much as we all love something that's aesthetically pleasing, if that takes away from our ability to read that information or find that information, then it's actually doing a disservice to your resume as opposed to doing a benefit. So those are things to think about as well. And above all, make sure that the resume reflects you. Put your own personal style into it. Make sure that you've given these things some thought, that the paper choice, the font choices, the layout, they're all kind of part of your aesthetic, and they will all help to say something about you. And that's really important, making sure that the resume speaks about you in what you have done, but also kind of who you are as an artist in the theater. Those are all really important things. So kind of taking all of that together and putting together a really fun outline of what you've done in the industry. So that's kind of all I have to say on resumes, at least for now. Please list any questions or comments about resumes that you have down in the comment section below. I love answering your questions when they come up. Please, I encourage you to put them down there. If you have a question about something, it's really possible that somebody else has a question about something. And so by putting it down there, you're actually going to help other people find the answers to questions that they might have too. So never be afraid to ask a question. I love questions. Big fan. Also, if you have any recommendations for other videos that I should make, please list those down in the comments below. I'm super excited to make content that you are interested in, as well as the things that I want to make. So that's going to do it for now. Thank you all for being here. I hope you learned a few things about resumes. Have a great day, and we'll see you backstage.